shall we start, Kerry, and then
Yeah, sure, that'd be great.
you
Yes,
can
yeah.
join us as we carry on.
Okay.
So I'd just like to welcome everyone to this talk, this sort of conversation between myself and Kerry Hadley-Pryce. What we're thinking of doing in this 45 minutes is basically we'll introduce ourselves and we'll have a couple of chats with each other about writing and books and process and stuff like that. And we'll also do, we'll both do a couple of short readings interspersed with questions. And then perhaps towards the end, if anyone on the chat wants to ask questions, we'll try and answer them as well. So it's a kind of fairly relaxed thing we're going to do, but it would just be nice to have a kind of chat with another author whose work I greatly admire. So on that note, perhaps Kerry, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jonathan. Yeah, it's a pleasure actually, because we've had all of this COVID business and nobody's really been able to meet anybody. So it's always lovely to see Jonathan's face in any case. So I think the last time we did an event together was at Loughborough Library, was it? Something like that, many years back, probably 4.
Yeah, we did one at Birmingham Woodstones as well.
Yeah, was that? Yeah, that was true. When it was okay to do events like that. But yes, so I'm Kerry Hadley-Pryce, and I am a fellow SALT author alongside Jonathan. I've written 2 novels published by SALT, one called The Black Country and one called Gamble. My thing, if you like, is writing about fiction, writing fiction that's set in the Black Country, which is where I am and where I live. And my short stories are generally also there. I don't know, I'm just drawn to it. I live in it and I live it and I am it. And that's, we'll perhaps talk about that, a bit later. I'm in the midst of a PhD, my final year. And my PhD is a creative writing one, psychogeography in Black Country writing, Black Country fiction. I teach creative writing. I'm all creative writing. It's all about creative writing. I mentor a few people. I've sort of immersed myself into the kind of arena of short story and novel writing. It's something that when it comes to creative writing, is something that, and writers always say this, I have always done as a small child. This is what I always wanted to do, and kind of took a long time to get to it through the idea of teaching and various other jobs and things. So now it's a real joy to concentrate on doing the thing I like doing. So I know it's a real privilege to be able to do it. So yeah, that's me really. And Jonathan, I know, has got a far more exciting CV than I have. So
that's not. I'm not sure about that. Yeah, I'm Jonathan Taylor, and I suppose one thing I'm going to ask you about in a minute, Kerry, is about your emphasis on fiction. I write fiction as well. I've written 2 novels, which are both published by SALT, and short stories. I've got a short story collection coming out from SALT in a year or so. My second novel was called Melissa, but I also write poetry, and what I'm going to read in this event today is some poetry. I've published a couple of poetry collections, and I also write non-fiction, so memoir in particular. In fact, my first book was a memoir, which was about my father. It's published by Granta, unbelievably 14 years ago. And it was about my father and his Parkinson's disease and my experience of being a part-time carer. So I write in lots of different forms. And I also, like Kerry, I also teach creative writing. Most writers these days do. And I teach creative writing at Leicester University, where I run the MA in creative writing. So yeah, it's a huge pleasure always a massive pleasure to talk with you, Kerry. And I was going to ask you, like I say, the first thing I was going to ask you about is that sort of emphasis on particularly novels, but short stories as well, is uh, what do novels give you? I mean, have you been tempted by other forms, or what do they give you that other forms don't?
It's a really good question, actually, because you know, it's an entirely different thing, isn't it, writing novels than any other short form. I mean, I do write short stories, and but novels are the thing that I'm drawn to more than anything. And I don't know if that's more a personality thing, because I love a project. I love a project, and I think with with novels, they are almost an entity in and of themselves. You know, there is that theory, isn't there, the triple O theory, you know, where it says that, you know, objects are entities in and of themselves, and you kind of, you become part of them, as opposed to them being part of you. And I do think that my kind of writing and my novel writing is part of my obsessive personality. You know, I like something that you can really get involved in and really get into, and revisit and revisit and revisit, and sort of paint over and switch directions with, and so on. I mean, in particular, my second novel, I ended up having to write that 5 times, I think it was, because it just wasn't right. And yet, and that sounds like a real trauma, you know, to have to do that. God, you have to write this 5 times. But I've just loved it. I just loved each time getting to know what was happening, and what, you know, what this character was up to. Interestingly, when it comes to short stories, I know that a lot of there's a chap, isn't there, Neil Campbell, who also is a Salt author, and he says he writes he writes novels in between writing short stories. The short stories take him so long to do. I'm quite the opposite. You know, I can write short stories quite quickly. I know that you're not supposed to say this, but I can write I can write a short story quite quickly and be really quite happy with it. It's almost like a warm up, really. But with a novel, I sort of prefer that, the labour of it. I prefer the kind of, you know, research of it, and I prefer the kind of thinking endlessly about it, and waking up in the middle of the night and getting up and writing some more of it. I think it becomes a whole sort of process of joy for me, which perhaps, you know, says more about me than it does about the process itself, really. I would love to have a go at poetry, but there is something about poetry that scares me. I don't know why. I don't know why.
Yeah, it shouldn't. It does a lot of people, you know. That's kind of, you know, I teach poetry, and you know, it's amazing how daunted people are by it, you know.
Yeah.
But I remember just my old uh, PhD supervisor, who's a really good writer himself, and he said to me years ago, he said, teaching poetry should just be balloons. It should just be releasing, ultimately, hooray, it's poetry, you know, let's release the balloons, you know.
Yeah.
And Michael Rosen says something sort of similar, you know, about poetry, that it should just be joy. And,
Yeah.
you know, this idea that, you know, that is very prevalent, I think, in Britain, but much less so in other countries. That
Right.
there's a kind of, that there's forms, that there's conventions, that somehow you have to take it very seriously. I think it's just wrong. It's just damaging. You know, it should be joy. What's the point of writing or reading. If ultimately, and even someone like Wordsworth, who I love, but doesn't always have a reputation for joy, even he said that um, the main aim of being a writer is to give your reader pleasure.
Yeah.
So I find it all mystifying, really, the kind of attitude towards poetry.
Yeah.
That is so kind of, we must be very serious,
Yeah.
and
Very
we
thoughtful.
must know everything. Yeah. But I think what you say about novels is totally right, and it's that immersiveness, isn't it, that you have in a novel,
Yeah.
which I mean, I write, as I say, in lots of different forms, but the thing that novel writing particularly does give me is that I live in it when I'm writing it. I just live in that world. And I recently started a kind of draft of a third novel, and it's total, at the moment the draft is total, no one could read it, it's total gobbledygook
Yeah, I know
for
what you
anyone else,
yeah.
written in code that even I can't understand. But the world, I get the world, I'm in the world of it, it's in my head all the time. And it's those, and the people and so on and so forth. In that way, it's kind of a bit like a computer game, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
It's
It is.
experience.
It's like a puzzle, isn't it? It's like a puzzle that you're kind of teasing out in this almost scientific way, but not really, not in a science that is your own in some ways. So yes, I completely understand. I completely understand that. And your novel, in fact, both your poetry and your novel, because your kind of latest poetry anthology with that fabulous cover, the Cassandra Complex. That is a fantastic cover that's quite scary, but says everything there is to say about what the Cassandra Complex is about. They're sort of both your novel and that particular anthology are very heavily laden with ideas about psychological theory, really, aren't there? There's some sort of psychology involved in both. I read, I've got it here actually, Oliver Sacks's Musicophilia before I read Melissa, because it's there's a link, isn't there, between those two things.
There's a
and
really
I wondered how much, well, you're obviously influenced by theory, I suppose, if you for want of a better word. Is it do you look when you, and then do these kind of theories present themselves to you, or do you go looking for them?
I am influenced by theory and philosophy and science, very much so. And no doubt part of that's kind of the academic background. Part of it's just that I want to learn stuff. You read to learn things, don't you? Something that's kind of a bit underrated, I think, that you don't, even if whatever it is you're reading, you're reading to learn stuff about people, about how behaviors, about emotion, and so on and so forth. So I love learning stuff. It's also the Oliver Sacks connection in particular. He's one of the writers that I've always felt closest to, and there are reasons for that, which is that so as I say, my first book was a memoir about my father's Parkinson's disease, and I remember in the early kind of 2000s, sitting down with a copy of Awakenings by Oliver Sacks, and just reading it, and just my jaw dropping open, just thinking, oh God, all of these behaviors, all of these patterns in my dad's illness, they've all got names, and it was just this moment of recognition that no one had told us these things at the time, that actually so many of these patterns had been codified and theorized and so on and so forth. And so but also, you know, Oliver Sacks is also a great storyteller. So he tells stories about illness that are incredibly engaging.
Yeah.
So there was that kind of moment of recognition, which I think is really important. And um, uh, and so uh, and then ever since then, obviously, I've been interested in, especially the neuroscience
Yeah.
and so on and so forth, which really influenced Melissa in
Yeah.
many ways. But yeah, I mean, I definitely kind of I'm fascinated by ideas, and I want books to be stories, but I also want to learn stuff from them and find out things and so on and so forth. So hence why my reading is all over the place. You know,
Yeah.
one moment I'm reading science fiction, next moment I'm reading philosophy, next moment I'm reading this, that, and so on and so forth. But I mean, do you find? I mean, your characters, Kerry. You know, we've talked about this a bit before. Is that I've especially with Gamble, I was thinking, I kept sort of thinking, what is it? What is his illness? You know, I wanted to diagnose him. You know, I wanted that. You know, and it felt like this is such an astute, clever, mystifying portrait of someone's extreme psychology that I want to know more. You know, so do you not have a diagnosis in mind when you're writing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you should say that, really, because as I said, with Gamble, I wrote and rewrote and rewrote and rewrote that novel, and it the first iteration of it was entirely different. I mean, the only thing that remained the same throughout all of those goes at that novel was him, Gamble, the father, and I realized then that he was what I was writing about. He was what I was writing about rather than who I was writing about. And I suppose I don't think I had a kind of a mental or a psychological position in mind when I was writing about him. I think I was more writing about life, really, and the way that life affects or can affect someone in an area like this. You know, I think what I was trying to do was to associate him with the, you know, kind of odd changes that have taken place in the Black Country as a place. This kind of geo-humanistic look at the way that place affects a person and the way that a person can be like a place. Because the Black Country itself is this kind of post-rural amongst the post-industrial. There's a sort of a weird contradiction that only people in the Black Country don't see as a contradiction, but you do if you're outside of it. And I felt that with him, there were contradictions within him. He was I sort of wanted to portray him, or he came about as being a bright, kind of, bright and interesting individual with some capability, who had, for some reason, things had just halted with him, and this had made him think or want things differently than he might have done. He was at a moment in his life, or a time in his life, more than a moment, where he was kind of on a cliff edge, if you like, you know, of change. And I think what's interesting is that men who have read this have been the reaction has been really interesting, because some people have gone, I think he's appalling. Oh, he's awful. What a terrible man. How terrible. He's done terrible things. That's awful. Others have gone, I think I sometimes think like that. Yeah. I sometimes have those thoughts. And I really enjoyed, I suppose it was the whole process of having to write and rewrite and write and rewrite, really kind of excavating into those kind of Gamble synapses that you know, when I first started off, I was just very surface level. This is what happened and this is how he did it and so on. So I wasn't really thinking about, I suppose I wasn't really thinking about a psychological state, although in some ways there's an implicit psychological state because he's kind of trapped here in this strange place.
I mean, so
no, but that,
no, it's fascinating, and it's sort of one of the things that is really striking is that you know, you've totally got inside the psychology of a male character. And in Melissa, I always feel that the character that I understood the most was Serena, who's the sort of teenage daughter.
Yeah.
So we're both kind of writing across genders in many ways, and and I do write a lot of female, I do write a lot of female characters, and so I don't know. I mean, how do you feel about that?
I have thought about this, and I think, and I've noticed it in your writing as well, and I think possibly it's easier in some ways to write something or somebody different to you because you're kind of looking at them from it. Sometimes if things are too close, too much you, it's hard to verbalize and it's hard to write it down, and it feels odd. It feels a bit self-serving, or it doesn't feel it doesn't feel right because it's not exactly how you feel. But if you're creating a character, often it's probably better, or perhaps you find it better to there is an entirely different person, in terms of gender or outlook or culture or whatever, that you can create because they are entirely different to you, without sort of any policing that's going on in your mind that says, well, that's not what you're thinking. That's not.
I totally agree. I absolutely agree. And that people say, don't they, that all writing is autobiography. And I always think when people say that, it's like, yeah, but autobiography isn't autobiography.
No, exactly.
In that when you often, so many memoirs are not about they're about someone close to you, someone else.
Yeah.
That actually, my memoir is about, really, I mean, it's partly about me, but it's really about my relationship with my father.
Right.
And so I think that, I mean, there's no point in writing literature unless you can jump outside yourself.
Exactly.
Otherwise it's just solipsism, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah, it is. And is your next the piece that you're working on now, is that a memoir?
Yes. So I've kind of I've got various things on the go, but after many years of not writing memoir, I've sort of come back to it. And so I'm writing a book about, I mean, in a way, it's a collection of personal essays. So it's also about other people's experience and literary experience, but particularly it's basically, the theme is the uses and abuses of power in education. So bullying, in the short version is bullying, and to some extent discipline. That I grew up at a kind of moment when I was at high school, literally halfway through my high school was the moment that they changed from corporal punishment to, that they banned corporal punishment. And the kind of, so part of one of the big chapters is partly about that, the difference between the different kinds of discipline and bullying that happened between that time. And also, it's just sort of something that absolutely fascinates me. That kind of, and I'm not writing about sort of so much about why people are bullied, because I think that's covered by lots and lots of books. I'm really writing about how, and sometimes there is no why. In my experience, sometimes it is just power, so it's been, I mean, it sounds like a really serious book, but actually my part of it, my experiences, a lot of them are just absolutely absurd. I mean, some of the kind of things that happened when we were kids were just ridiculous,
Yeah.
and some of the behaviour both of teachers and the pupils was
Bizarre.
awful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think about when I started. I started I started as a secondary school teacher, and I started as a secondary school teacher in 1999. That was September 99. And I look back on those first few years and think, how did we ever get away with? I mean, there was no corporal punishment or anything, but technology was different. Pupils and students were different. Their expectations were different. Their futures looked different. And so, it even in that kind of relatively short period of time, situations have changed, and people behave and react in different ways, don't they, to different situations.
They do. And one of the things that really fascinates me is the way in which the one thing that doesn't seem to change, which is just a kind of general attitude towards teenagers, which I don't like, where as soon as kids go to high school, it's like some kind of doctrine of original sin, where they where they're somehow inherently bad, and therefore have to be disciplined. And it's like, actually, maybe if you treated them really, really well and really nice, maybe they'd actually behave well. I mean, I'm a kind of idealist, and I think that people generally behave well naturally, and so it's fascinating. And there is a real link here with your work, Kerry, and both books are about teachers,
They are, yes, they are, yeah. Well, they say, don't they, write about what you know. And I don't think I was sort of consciously writing about what I know or knew. But yes, in both cases, the male protagonists are teachers. And I suppose in some ways it's easy then, isn't it, to sort of include little quirks and aspects of things that are actually true. So if you've got a teacher reading this, they're going to know that actually does happen. This is the way that kids sometimes behave in classrooms and so on. And in the Black Country, actually, as you've mentioned, the this idea about teenagers, that circumstance, walking into a classroom where that you're out of control as a teacher. You've gone into this classroom. These are year 10, what are they, 14, 15? They've bought into the ideas about teenagers. They don't really want to be in school. They're going to make your life a misery. And when it comes to the sort of bullying arrangement, the whole tables have turned. And in the Black Country, Harry, the teacher, feels that everything in his life is going off whack, and he walks in and he's just got to get some kind of control back, and that, not that precise thing that happened, but those kinds of arrangements do happen. Teachers, I've been in situations, not me personally, but at schools where teachers have said, oh my God, I just had to get control back in that classroom of 33 kids. It was like a madhouse. And that really is an element of what happens, which is great if you're writing a novel, because it sort of contains all the elements of surprise and suspense that readers seem to quite like reading. And making judgments about, I think, is another thing, isn't it?
And I think that's one of the things that's really fascinated me, is the way in which the power dynamics just change all the time, in education, in really fascinating ways. Kerry, would you like to perhaps if we just have 2 or 3 minutes reading each, and then we can answer the question. There's a couple of questions that come up.
A couple of questions. I noticed that. Yeah. Shall I read a bit from? I'll read a bit from Gamble. Actually, I'll stop if it's going on for too long. The bit I wanted to read was Gamble is a teacher, and his daughter is in, I don't know, year 9 or year 10 of the school where he works, and he has a day where it's a really good day, everything's fine, and then he's resting in the, the day is finished, and he thinks actually maybe life isn't too bad. And then the head teacher comes out and says that she's got his daughter in her office because his daughter's been having a fight with another. This happens, a fight with another pupil. So they have the conversation in Miss Henshaw's office, and then he has to go home. He has to take his daughter home. And there's an incident in the car that I wanted to sort of just go through. Okay, so he'll tell how they left Miss Henshaw's office, both of them like prisoners being expelled. And in the car on the way back home, Isabel was at first wary, tightly wound, like a creature waiting for something inevitable. Gamble found himself glancing at her hands and thinking about the forming of a fist, of punching. He'll say he wondered where that had come from, who had put that into her. But it set him at odds with himself, the way she continued to pick at her sleeves and roll the bits of fluff and tease them into tiny black specks. It irritated him. And the way they just weren't speaking, the two of them, it made the atmosphere, the car, the inside of it, thick with thought. He'll say he could see the outline of her head in his peripheral vision, looking tight with self-defense or pride, or that simmering self-possession she developed somehow. And he'll say he let himself examine what he was feeling, because it occurred to him that there is something about being a passenger in a car. He'll say he was thinking something about how vulnerable that makes you, how much you must trust the driver. There is something about the gestural exactness of things, the coordination of the mechanics of it for the driver, and how unclear cut it must be for the passenger, especially a young one, and especially when it's getting dark. He could, he thought, drive off the road and into a tree, or at least aim for one. He could swerve into the line of oncoming traffic, or he could shoot a red light. It would be terrifying for a passenger. It would be edifying, though, and a passenger would be powerless. He'd slung his jacket on the back seat. He knew the pocket was within reach if he stretched, and he did. It meant he had to lean awkwardly through the gap between his seat and Isabel's. He felt his breath bounce off her as she leaned across. At the same time, he accelerated just a little, as if one movement had caused the other. With one hand, he scooped out his pack of cigarettes from his jacket pocket. Beside him, Isabel was as good as passive. She didn't even flinch. And he couldn't work out how false that was. He saw she'd had her ear pierced. He saw the glint of an earring, a flower of some kind. He only saw that then. He didn't know she'd had that done, and that annoyed him. He glanced down at the dashboard and impulsively, he'll say, watched his speed begin to increase. He shook the pack of cigarettes. It was intentional, that. He wanted, he'll say now, to incite something. When he took both hands off the wheel, he realised that was something he hadn't done in years, steer with his knees, that is, and that it was something Carolyn didn't like him doing back then. So he made his movements, the selection of the cigarette from the pack, the placing of it in between his lips, the search for the lighter in his trouser pocket, deliberate, unemotional, complicated. The road ahead was clear, dark, rolling towards them, like a film reel. The spark from the lighter's flame set a bluishness about things, and he held it up against the tip of the cigarette for longer than he needed to. In that light, he could see how unangelic Isabel looked. He knew the speed was creeping up, and there was a junction approaching. This was his usual route home. He knew every bump, every pothole, every imperfection in the road. He'd driven it for years, too many years, he'll say now. He inhaled smoke deeply. Tar felt thick in his mouth, his throat. It had started to rain, but he didn't bother with the wipers, and outside was going past in small sparks. All of this was making him feel lightheaded. He didn't slow down. Trees, were they oaks, tapped past, butterfingered, and he became acutely, beautifully aware of his surroundings. The outside just then, already going past at 50 miles an hour, maybe more. Isabel made a sound, a throaty one, and it might have been a cough. The car was filling with smoke. Up ahead, the whiteness and redness of the stop sign. Leave that one there. They survived, by the way, but yeah, I just thought I'd thank you. I just thought I'd leave that one there. It was a very, I loved writing that that sort of sense of growing agitation that that the character's got with everything about his life, really. But yeah, anyway, there's more to that scene, but it takes a little while long to read. And I thought that you, Jonathan, would like to read some of your, were you going to read some poetry? Oh, Jonathan's been muted. That's, you're in the naughty chair. Okay, so we'll have a quick look while Jonathan's being unmuted at some of the questions, or one of the questions. Fran's given us a little question. She said, she really liked what I was saying about enjoying rewriting and refining the novels. And she's asked about prior planning. Well, we'll talk about prior planning once, I think, when Jonathan's done a bit of reading, because I'm sure that he's got some ideas to talk about that. But are you back with us, Jonathan?
I am, yes, I am.
You're in the naughty. You're on the naughty chair.
I'm always in the naughty chair, Kerry. But yeah. So if I just, what I'll do is I'll just read, because you've got sort of 8 or 9 minutes. So I'll just read a couple of short poems, and then yeah, we can talk about a bit about process.
Yeah,
and that'd be great. I'll read one that's actually partly about my father, and it kind of ties in with one or two things we were talking about earlier about place. And then I'll read one slightly longer one, which does deal with, in a kind of weird metaphorical sense, with some of the kind of scientific ideas that I'm interested in.
Yeah, good.
So this short poem is called "This Poem is Too Neat." So this poem is too neat. The end of this poem will be too neat, too pat. It will do that circular thing of coming back to an image or memory at the start, of connecting something very early with something sad years later. The start of the poem will describe my very first memory of leaving the outdoor Art Deco Lido in Trenton Gardens, which was full of dozens of mummies' bare legs and was apparently closed when I was 4. I recall all of us shivering in towels in the car and asking my father what pneumonia was, because he'd told us he'd get it if we didn't leave right away. He explained what it was, and many years later, he did get it, and he died. I told you the end of this poem would be too neat, too pat, as if a poem can lock you into a pattern and there's no getting out of it. So I'll read one other poem, which is kind of slightly more crazy, and it's called Determinism, and is the closest I've ever got to writing what is in effect a love poem, because it was written on the occasion of my 10th wedding anniversary for my wife, whose only comment was, "You are the only person, Jonathan, who could write a love poem called Determinism." So this is Determinism. Because I wasn't yet too drunk to see your legs, because the union watered down its pints, because you'd got over tonsillitis and wanted to see some band I can't recall, because that morning your crisps were heart-shaped, because you'd gone to Warwick, not, thank God, Oxford, because slow as ever I'd taken too long to do my course, because you'd wanted to escape a home of arranged marriages, forced exile, angry relatives, and no doubt, therefore, because of previous marriages, forced exile, angry relatives. So because of 74 invasions, displacements, and on my family's side, because of 1930s poverty, people marrying people they shouldn't, children and money changing hands, and later because of divorce, ECT, second marriages, all with roots in post-World War I depression, World War I itself, what happened to an archduke, industrial revolutions in Britain and Germany, particularly that of the cotton industry, and ultimately because of pre-industrial feudalism in Britain or Cyprus or somewhere else, as well as apes, evolution, language, tools, that bloody butterfly who was always flapping his wings in Rio, causing hurricanes in Moscow, even before Rio and Moscow were invented, and long before butterflies, Rio or Russia, a 14 billion year-long prehistory back to first because if space-time isn't linear, somewhere in the future, dreaming of being born with Rosie and Miranda, because of everything, which is no doubt philosophically speaking the same as saying nothing, I asked you if you wanted a drink, and you said yes. And without sounding overly pathetic about it, a universe was in those words.
Oh, Jonathan, you old softy.
That's as sentimental as I get.
I thought that was brilliant. That was lovely. I bet Maria thought that was great, really. That was really very clever. And you've kind of you talk a little bit when you speak about poetry about the way that poems can encompass time. You know, that kind of use of the way that time can move in poetry. Greg Ledbetter talks a bit about that as well. He talks about, you know, how poetry works on us in a different way to any other form, and that it allows us to do that, you know, time travel. In fact, didn't you wrote a poem called Time Travel, didn't you? Which is actually quite beautiful, I thought.
I totally believe that. I think that you could separate forms and genres according to their conceptualizations of time. You know, so in novels, I think generally are very linear. I mean, I know there's plenty of non-linear novels and plenty of novels that mess up time, but generally speaking, we kind of expect them to be kind of quite linear in time, don't we?
We do.
Whereas poems can literally jump, you know,
millennia,
a million years in one line, and people will expect that, you know. So it's fascinating. It's just a different way of reading, I think.
It is, and I think Greg Ledbetter's got something really interesting to say about the way that we read poetry, and therefore the way we write it. But that kind of leads us very nicely to Fran's question that we were looking at before, which is about process, and she's asking, how much prior planning do you do at the beginning of the process, and do you find that the final draft ends up completely different to what you originally intended? Well, here's my quick answer. I do a lot of prior planning, and it always ends up entirely differently. I like to work, you know, I think when I'm writing that first draft, I like to work to a bit of a skeleton, but then I allow myself to think, well, actually now I know this character a bit better, they probably wouldn't do that, so we're going to move off in that direction. So my planning fills piles and piles of very big art sketch pads, and whilst I need to start with a plan, I always change it. I don't know about you, Jonathan. How does it work for you?
I think it totally depends on the form I'm writing in. But with novels, I definitely I have an idea of. I often have an image at the beginning and an image at the end, and then I'm kind of working out how they connect. So I'm kind of thinking all the time in terms of scenes. You know what? I mean, maybe really. Someone said to me a few years ago, said perhaps you're a playwright, really, Jonathan, because which is the one form I'd never written. But you know that I do think in those terms of I want that scene between those two people. I want that. I want an argument between those two people, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of I do plan, but so much of it is just in my head, and that is what we were saying earlier about just living it. But I'm living a separate life in my head. It's kind of
Yeah,
all the characters are walking around in there, sort
yeah,
of deciding what to do.
yeah.
Um, shall we just very quickly, because we're kind of running out of time, but very quickly, the first question, which was
Oh,
you're on the first, can only take 2 books from your personal library. So it's a kind of desert island books question. What would you choose, Kerry?
I would choose. I would choose a Paul Auster book called The Music of Chance. I love Paul Auster, and there's something about the atmosphere in his writing that I really, really like. I'd have to think really carefully about the second book. Come back to me. Come back to me. And but definitely because I can't think that quickly.
It's really hard, isn't it?
It is hard. This is so many, and I don't have a favorite book because there's so many books that I keep reading. I think that's great. Oh no, this is brilliant. So I don't have one that I return to a lot. Laurie Moore is another excellent writer of short stories. I might take her. So yeah, what about you?
Oh, it's almost impossible, isn't it? But I suppose I've always said that my desert island book would probably be Bleak House by Dickens, which is the ultimate immersive experience, and he just creates this interconnected world where, and I would just love the time to read it again
Yeah,
because I read it 20 years ago and I've never had the chance. I don't reread things very often,
no, right.
how what a luxury it is to reread something, but it's something that you feel that you could live in. And I think Dickens is very much, maybe he's one of the people who invented that about novels, that kind of immersiveness,
You know, you came to the
Um,
Black Country, don't you?
yeah,
Wandering about the Black Country about the Curiosity Shop.
yeah. It's an impossible question, isn't it? But
It is.
is
It's
it?
really, really hard.
It's something that we all think about, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it would have to be something that you could reread over and over again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there aren't many books. I
Find
mean,
different stories in. Yeah.
yeah.
Thanks for that question. Now we're all confused and worried.
Yeah, but perhaps I think we're sort of meant to wrap it up here,
We
sort
are.
of 45 minutes. But it's
Yeah.
been such a pleasure, Kerry, talking
Been
to
an
you.
absolute delight.
You
Lovely
know,
to see you.
yeah, and we could sort of, I'm sure we could talk a lot more. I mean, the question about process, it's so many things we could say about it, isn't it? It's kind of one of these things that I just think is fascinating
Yeah.
the way people work, and all writers write in such different ways,
Yes, we do.
Um,
But it's been
yeah,
an absolute joy to do this. It feels almost normal now.
it does.
And
It's
I'm looking forward to reading your memoir when you've finished it and then it's published and your anthology of
yeah,
short stories coming up soon.
yeah. And you're finishing a third novel, is that right, Kerry?
Yeah, yeah. Third novel it's going to be called God's Country. Again, it's set in the Black Country. It's a very short novel. It's not even 50,000 words, so you can read it on a bus ride to Dudley. So yeah, all be good.
That's brilliant.
Good.
Oh, thank you, Kerry. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Yeah, thanks.
And yeah, okay, bye-bye.